Hello everyone, good morning. It's really lovely to be here. I want to open by saying that all the learning this week in Matan is being dedicated in memory of Becky Barth, a dear student of Matan. I have been really privileged to be learning for, 6 straight years now in Matan's Bet Midrash programs. Starting with the Morot Halakhic program, where we learned for 2 years Hilchot Nida and other life cycle events so that we could be of service to the community and answer questions. I then had a baby, took a small break, came back and joined for part of the Shabbat course. And for the last 2 years, I've been studying in the Bet Midrash program of Isser V'Heter here, and learning halachot of basar v'chalav, etc., etc. And I have thoroughly enjoyed learning halakha over these years in a Bet Midrash program on such a high level. And the main point that I have got out of all of this learning is that the more that we can understand the process of the halakha and gain an appreciation of the principles that are used in the halakhic process, the more meaningful the halakha becomes to us. And so I hope really over the year that I will share in part some of that love and enthusiasm for halakha that I have with all of you. So let's begin. We have... I'm so proud of you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm so thankful to you. We have as our title Contemporary Halakhic Dilemmas. So we'll take different topics and we will explore them. Now, my main purpose, as I've just mentioned, is that we should all gain an appreciation of the halakhic process, that we should gain an understanding of the background and the issues involved in every topic that we are analysing. And therefore, when we get to the bottom line, the psak halakha, we can appreciate it that much more deeply. So if I throw out to you straight away, what is halakha? How should we define this term halakha? Any suggestions?
Technically, law.
Okay, absolutely. Anything else?
It means the parts, presumably it's the path forward from the right or whatever to the Rabbanit to the law.
Okay, so both of them I like. Halakha is a legal system that is determining and guiding many areas, if not all areas of our life. And if we look at the root of the word halakha, if we look at the shoresh, from lalekhet, to go, we can see that it is therefore showing us the path. You mentioned, your name please? Leslie, okay, thank you. Leslie mentioned that the path could be seen to be from the Oraita through all the way through the history of the evolution of halakha. We can also see halakha, the route, to move, to go, to be showing us that we are going from written, static, general principles, and it is the movement from them to its application in real life, to the plethora of real life situations and challenges and questions that present themselves to us. It really teaches us the path on which to go, to follow in the direction of the Torah, etc. Now, halakha is made up of Torah shebichtav, the written law, and Torah shebal peh, the oral law, which is Mishnah, Gemara, etc., the Talmud. And they necessarily go hand in hand. There's barely a detail or a rule given in the Torah that doesn't require further explanation or further interpretation or further expansion in the Torah shebal peh. And so we have Torah shebichtav and Torah shebal peh going hand in hand. And we can see, if you look exactly... Okay, before we look at source one, actually, if we think of any question that may come to mind, okay, any of the topics that we may cover, any question that's ever popped into your head and you think, what will halakha say about this matter? Okay, what are we going to do to reach a conclusion, to find an answer? So we have a question, what does halakha say about it? And then we have to follow a methodology to go through a process to reach a conclusion, rather than saying, well, I want the conclusion to be this, or I think the conclusion should be this is my agenda. Then I'm going to go back and find sources that can back me up. This can work, right? I feel that's a fair statement. This can work, but that is not the ideal way of dealing with halakha. Halakha is this process, as Leslie said really correctly. And what we're going to try and do is follow that process and understand that methodology. So if you see in the first source, sorry, they're not numbered, but we're okay for source 1 at the moment. Has everyone got a source sheet? Are there spares? Okay, amazing, thank you. We see in Sefer Dvarim, et kol hadavar asher anochi metzaveh etchem oto tishmeru la'asot lo tosef alav v'lo tigram mimenu. Everything that I've commanded you to do, you should keep. Do not add to it and do not detract from it. And so we see explicit in the Torah itself this statement that the Torah is there unchanging. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. Do you want to come to a table so you can go sit there? Yeah. Within the Torah itself, explicitly written, this statement that the Torah is unchanging. We cannot add to it, we cannot detract from it. However, the Torah is there open for interpretation. And as we said, this is the job, this is actually the necessary role to be played by the Torah Shebaal Peh. So we have a statement, important to remember that it's in the Torah itself, that says that the Torah is unchanging. This, by the way, is codified by the Rambam in one of his 13 principles of faith, that the Torah, can never be changed. But then we know, also written in the Torah itself, I haven't brought it for you, that lo bashamayim hi, that the Torah is not in heaven, that the Torah is given into our hands, and once it's in our hands, it is there, open to interpretation, to different understandings, etc. And this concept of lo bashamayim hi is born in a really beautiful Agadic story in the Gemara. If you look at the second source, we have this story about the Tanur Shalachnai. Now, what was this Tanur? They were discussing the status of an oven. They were discussing whether it was pure or impure for ritual purposes. So I'm going to pick up the story in the 4th line. Let's see. And it says in the 4th line, Heshiv Rabbi Eliezer called Shuvot Shebaolam v'lo kiblu hemenu. There is a debate, there is a disagreement in the Bet Midrash as to the status of this oven. And the majority of opinions are in contrast to Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. So he's standing there, the minority view, and he's really insistent that he's correct, and he's trying to persuade them of his view. And so he's offering all the answers in the world, all the persuasions in the world, trying to convince them, but they don't accept his view. Amar lahem. So then he turns to them and says, Im halakha kmoti. Well, if I'm right, and if the halakha is like my opinion, charuv ze yochiach. This carob tree is going to prove my stance. Ne'ekar charuv mimkomo me'a ama v'amar le arba me'ot ama amur le ein mevi'in ra'aya min hacharov. So then, indeed, this carob tree gets up and it moves, and it proves that he is right. But they simply answer, no, we don't bring proofs from carob trees. And he does the same trick a few times. He says, well, the water of this stream is going to flow, what do you call it, upstream, right? It's going to flow against the natural flow of water. And the water does, the stream flows upstream, and they are totally unimpressed. And then he turns to the walls of the Bet Midrash and tells them to start disintegrating, and they do so, and again, they are unimpressed. And then we are going to jump to the second page, So the second page, he says, Im halakha moti. Well, if halakha is like me, min hashamayim yochichu. From the heavens, I'm going to prove this. Yatzata bat kol va'amra. And then a bat kol, a divine voice, is emanating from the heavens, va'amra, and it says, Malachem etzel Rabbi Eliezer, shahalakha kmoto. What are you fighting about anymore? It's quite clear that Rabbi Eliezer is right. The bat kol itself declares Rabbi Eliezer is right. In every situation. Amad Rabbi Yoshua, who's the head of the majority posse, stands up, Amad Rabbi Yoshua al Raglav va'amar, and he says, Lo bashamayim hi. But we know in the Torah it is written, Lo bashamayim hi. The Torah is not in heaven. Even a divine voice emanating from heaven is not impressing us, is not influencing us one bit, because we know Lo bashamayim hi. The Torah is no longer in heaven. It has been given down here into human hands, and it's for us to now make the decision. If we just skip to the very last full line, there's a little postscript to this story about what Hashem was doing at this time when these events and the tricks were all being performed in the Bet Midrash. And it says about Hashem, Chiyech, he smiled, Va'amar, Nitzchuni banai, Nitzchuni banai. He smiled and he said, my sons, my children have triumphed over me. They've beaten me, they've won the day, they've triumphed over me. Meaning that when they stood up and the carob tree didn't affect them and the water flowing and the walls disintegrating, nothing touched them, and not even the bat kol would sway them from their position. That is what Hashem wants. That is the system that we have in place. And he's smiling and saying, my sons have triumphed over me. They are in control of the halakha. That's the way I planned it. I want the system to be thus, that the Torah was given on Har Sinai and it is now in the hands of humans. Or a similar but very lovely reading into this last statement by Rav Soloveitchik is, Nitzchuni banai, from the Shorish Netzach, my sons have eternalized me, my sons have eternalized me. If they're going to behave like this, then I know that they will forever be bringing my Torah to life. They will forever be arguing over halakhic matters. They'll forever be debating and delving into halakha, and it will never run dry and it will never grow stale, because they are keeping it alive, a real living law. So we can see from this story that when we say Lo bashamayim hi, when it's written in the Torah Lo bashamayim hi, this is now how the system is supposed to be, a law in the hands of humans to be interpreted. When we have the law in our hands, possibly, inevitably, I could say, there will be two or more interpretations that are offered in the Bet Midrash amongst the sages. And these two or more opinions will often contradict each other. And then we say, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim. These opinions and these opinions, this ruling and this ruling, both of them are the word of Hashem. Both of them are true, are correct. Now, obviously, for practical purposes, to have a bottom line, so we rule in one direction or the other, and we have a psak halakha, but that doesn't mean that the other view or views are invalidated. We have merely, through different mechanisms, chosen a view to take to rule on in practice, because we live in a practical world, but the other views are still there. We don't invalidate their truth. And we can see in the next source as to why perhaps we have this system that allows for a plethora of different interpretations, that we have a system that actually seems to value contradictory opinions. So if we look here in the Talmud Yerushalmi, we read, Amar Rav Yanai. Rav Yanai is answering this very question. Ilu nitna haTorah chatucha lo haita laregel amida. If the Torah had rather been given to us very clear cut, very black and white, very, very clear what the answer was in every situation, there wouldn't be room for any maneuver. There would be no room for any creativity, any personal interpretations. It wouldn't have any movement, any dynamic nature. And it continues to say, Ma'itama, Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe, Amar lefanav. What did Moshe originally say to Hashem? Ribono shel olam. He turns to Hashem and he says, Hodieni he'achi ha'halakha. Can you show me how halakha is supposed to be? You've given me something with general principles. And perhaps the question is, can you tell me the answer to any possible question that would be raised? Amar lo, but Hashem responds to Moshe and he says, Acharei rabim lahatot. What you should do is apply the principle of Acharei rabim lahatot. Follow the majority, as we saw in our case of the Tanur Shalachnai. Follow the majority. If there is a debate, you follow the majority view. Rabu hamazakin, Rabu hamachayvin. Whatever the majority says, that's what you should do in practice. Kedei shetehei haTorah nidreshet memtet panim tamei or memtet panim tahar. In order that the Torah is open to 49 possible answers of this is tamei because of such and such reasoning, and simultaneously it's open to 49 possible answers of tahar. No, I think it's tahar for such and such possible reasonings or logic. And therefore it is really built into the system that there should be these contradictory views, and they are valued, and each one is a truth in a way, bless you. And the situation is both deliberate and valuing these different angles, views of the Torah. We mentioned that halakha is a legal system. And with any legal system, you start from general principles and then you interpret them. And interpretation of the law plays a really, really key role. As I found out, when I was in university, I did a law degree. And one of the very first lectures, I really will never forget, the professor comes in and she says, we're discussing today the interpretation of law. We have a huge corpus of statutes and laws in the British legal system. And, that may indicate that everything is very cut and dry, but, I'm going to show you, to the contrary, the key role that interpretation plays. And I didn't fully appreciate it until she presented a very simple, seemingly simple example, and then proceeded to spend the rest of the lecture discussing this one example alone. She said, take, for example, the rule or the law, no vehicles allowed in the park. So how would you interpret that? So you would say, well, it means you may not come into the park driving a vehicle. But what about the park warden driving his little van around to collect the rubbish, to rake up the leaves, etc., etc.? Is he allowed in? So, one could argue, okay, well, that's the rule, but in the small print somewhere, there are some exceptions written. For example, the exception is the park warden can come in to clean up. But is the park warden allowed to drive in for any other purpose? The second you institute an exception, you allow an exception to a rule, the list is going to be endless. You're going to have more and more questions, etc. Another exception may be that you can have emergency vehicles in the park. Okay, emergency vehicles in the park, I think it would be understood that within this rule, there would have to be an exception for an emergency vehicle to enter to rescue a child who's fallen into the park pond. Would it be so clear that the emergency vehicle can come in to rescue someone's dog that fell in the park pond? Maybe there'd be a debate as to that matter. There'd be a disagreement as to whether or not. You can see straight away that the simplest of simplest examples is just open to a whole range of interpretations. And we didn't even get to what is the definition of a vehicle in itself. And so we can see that the Torah is unchanging was our starting point, but interpretation does indeed play a very, very key role. What are the mechanisms and the principles which we apply in this process of interpretation of halakha? So one of the main mechanisms that is employed throughout the Torah Shebaal Peh is that of svara. Svara is the idea of logic or common sense. And svara is given a lot of weight. If a conclusion has been reached and it is based on sound reasoning and logic, then the need for a verse, for a pasuk from the Torah to back up that conclusion is deemed irrelevant. So if someone reaches a conclusion and they've explained their logical reasoning for doing so, they won't be demanded to bring a verse in support of their position. And we see this in the next source. We've got a little subheading, svara, and we have a Mishnah underneath, which discusses a case of a woman, ha'isha she'amra. What does she say? Eshet ish hayiti ugrusha ani ne'emenet. If a woman comes along and says, I was married, now I am divorced, she is trusted, she is believed. The reason is given, and they employ this principle, a logical principle that says the same mouth that forbade her to anyone else if she was married is the mouth that's now declaring her status is permitted. The same mouth that declares one status is now declaring the opposite status. So it follows logically that it should be trusted, it should be accepted. The Gemara, I'm jumping now to where you see a big Gimel Mem. Gemara then picks up on this point. Amar Avasi, minayin lehapesh asar hu hapesh hitir min haTorah. So he says, well, this principle, where do I know about this principle? Where do I find backing for this principle in the Torah? Shene'emar, as it says, and he brings his opinion of the basis in the Torah for this principle. But look what happens. The Gemara itself challenges this and says, I've just jumped 2 lines, Lama likra sparahi. The Gemara itself says, but why do you need a pasuk? Why do you need a verse supporting this principle? It's logical. It's based on svara, on common sense. So we see, very interestingly, that svara has such a power that anything that is considered to be logically argued is accepted as a rule, as a law, and doesn't need any backing in a verse. Svara also means that although we usually rule according to the majority, we discussed that principle before, this is just merely a pragmatic principle. When you have a disagreement, you need some way to reach a decision. So we have a pragmatic rule to follow the majority. But because of this principle of svara, we will sometimes follow the minority rule if the minority view has more compelling logic behind it. If either view is equally compelling, we follow the majority. If the minority view has a more sound reasoning, we will follow the minority view. And so we see again this emphasis that is put on svara in the process of interpreting halakha. The theoretical reason that we've looked at so far, the interpretation that Chazal use to apply the general rules of the Torah is often done through 13 principles that are listed. Yud Gimel Midot Shehatorah Nidreshet Bahem. We actually say this in Shacharit every morning in the Korbanot section. Different opinions as to what exactly all these principles are. But there are 13 hermeneutical rules which Chazal use to interpret the halakha. For example, I'll throw out a couple. One of the better known ones is Kal Vachomer, a very logical principle. Kal Vachomer, how much more so? If we have situation A, and the rule of situation A is that it is asur, then if we have situation B that comes to light, and we need to work out what is the answer to this specific situation, and situation B is far worse than situation A, it's far more problematic, then we say, well, if the rule in situation A was that it's asur, how much more so the rule in situation B must be forbidden as well, asur as well. The rule of Kal Vachomer is applying logic. However, there are limitations on it. For example, if somebody can come to you and say, actually, I view situation B as less bad than situation A. You pointed out that because of such and such feature, it's a more problematic situation. I actually think it's less problematic because of whatever reason. Then you can't apply the Kal Vachomer anymore. But you can see that the principle that was employed by Chazal many, many times throughout the Torah was one of pure logic. How much more so in this situation? It must be asur, or it must be mutar, it must be permitted. Another example is a gzerat shava, from shava lahashvat, to compare. You compare two situations, usually on a linguistic basis, and you say, for example, in the case of Pesach and Sukkot, we have chamisha asar in the pasuk, because Pesach is on Tet Vav B'Nisan. We have chamisha asar in the pasuk regarding Sukkot as well, because it's on Tet Vav Tishrei. And because of the comparison of chamisha asar and chamisha asar, we apply some of the technical halachot, the technical rules, from one chag to another. It seems to be an arbitrary decision, but there is a logic behind it because of this linguistic comparison between the two situations. So this is another principle that's applied. One more I'll throw out is the idea of a binyan av. You have a case, this is your case study, you learn its rules, but then any other cases which you can fit into the same category as this stereotypical case, any other cases that you can say are similar situations, you'll apply all the same rules to this situation. For example, tefillin is taken to be the stereotypical example of a mitzvah shazman grama, of a mitzvah which is time-bound. And if we can compare other mitzvot to tefillin, and we can say they are in the same category, they will have the same rules applied to them. So we can see that Svara has a lot of weight given to it, and there are different mechanisms used in applying this, so to speak, theoretical Svara, theoretical logic. But there's also a practical logic that is often employed in the interpretation of the Torah. What do I mean by a practical logic? It's almost an analysis of the practical needs of humans and the feasibility of a rule for humans, because halakha is now in human hands. For example, if we take the case of Eshet Yafat Toar, it's discussed in the Torah that if we have a soldier who is fighting a war and he desires this woman from the defeated army, he can only take her on the following conditions. And it lists the conditions that he must take her, and she can cry for her father's household for 30 days, let her hair grow long, let her nails grow long, maybe she'll become, despicable in his eyes, and only then, if he still desires to be with her, he must take her to be his wife. And these are the conditions that are set out in the Torah. Now, we can see in this scenario of Eshet Yafat Toar, first of all, that the Torah actually had a revolutionary approach towards women if we take it in the time of its given, when it was given, but also that it has an ability to recognize the nature of a person, to recognize the needs of a human, of a man, and to say, I'm not negating the needs, but I am going to work within human nature to elevate it as much as possible. There are so many conditions put in place that it's clear in which direction the Torah is going, in which direction it's heading. But it's also clear that the Torah does not negate or ignore human nature. We see this as well. We know that the rabbis can institute measures. They can, for instance, introduce gzerot if they are worried that a biblical command will be broken. So they put a boundary in place to ensure that the biblical command is safe. However, they will not do so unless they believe that the majority of the people will be able to uphold their gzerah. So again, it's very clear that there is a real appreciation for the needs of humans for the feasibility of the people performing or not a particular gzera, a particular law. We are told that if people are doing something wrong, we should rebuke them. But if we know that they won't change their ways, then we should not rebuke them, because it's better that they continue doing their actions out of ignorance rather than deliberately sinning. We see this written, if we flip over the page, again, sorry, the sources aren't numbered, so it's a bit difficult, but if you jump down to the middle of the page, okay, this is Gemara Baba Batra. It says this principle very clearly, Ela hanach lahem liYisrael. So leave Yisrael alone. Mutav sheyu shogegin. It's better that they are sinning by mistake, va'al yehiyu mazidin, and not that they are now doing a deliberate sin. This principle is applied many, many times throughout the Talmud, that we have an understanding of what people are able to take on or not, what people will respond to or not. And it's really an enlightening understanding that the halakha does really have its finger on the pulse to see where people stand. We've just finished the year of Shemitah, and there are several aspects of Shemitah which created real challenges for people. For example, there is a law that comes at the end of the year of Shemitah. It's called Shmitat Ksafim, and it means that the loans that have been given that are due for repayment, as the year of Shemitah arrives, these loans should the repayment of these loans should no longer be demanded. The aim of the Torah here, and we'll see it inside, the aim of the Torah here is that if the poor people have been granted loans and they are unable to pay them back, give them a fresh start. Shemitah is the time to give them an ability to start anew. The Torah says at the bottom of the page we were just on, V'zeh dvar hashmitah, shamot kol ba'al mashe yado asher yasheb re'ehu, lo yegosh et re'ehu ve'et achiv. Do not demand repayment of any loans. Do not stretch out your hand to receive your money back. Allow the loans to lapse and allow the money to remain with a poor person. But the Torah continues, I've skipped a couple of psukim. The Torah continues to say, because it's sort of anticipating what will be the natural response of people, of lenders. And it says, Hishamer lacha pen yehiyeh davar im levavcha b'li'al. Now, be careful not to say to yourself, Karva shnata sheva shnata shmita, v'ra'a encha ba'achicha ha'evyon, v'lo titenno. The year of Shemitah is arriving. And at the end of the year of Shemitah, there's Shmitat Ksafim, which means that I will cancel all the loans and I won't demand their repayment. So I'm just going to stop lending money to anyone because I don't have any security anymore. The Torah explicitly knows this may be a natural response to the rule of Shmitat Ksafim and says, don't let this cross your mind. Don't stop lending to the poor people as the year of Shemitah approaches. However, this is indeed what started to happen. Throughout history, this is what was happening. The lenders stopped loaning money as the year of Shemitah approached. And Hillel saw this phenomena and he decided that he is going to institute what is called a prosbul. He's going to institute a mechanism which allows the the repayment to be demanded, and therefore the rich people won't feel any need to stop lending to the poor people. The prosbul works because each individual transfers their loans into the hands of the Bet Din, and a loan in the hand of the Bet Din is not under Shmitat Ksafim. Its repayment may be demanded. Now, this could be seen, this institution of a prosbul could be seen to be going against the clear purpose of the Torah, which was that all loans should not be, their repayment should not be demanded at the end of the year of Shemitah. But the Gemara actually discusses the prosbul and actually shows how in the name of the prosbul itself we learn this, that it was something that aided both the rich and the poor. It was a fantastic mechanism. It allowed the rich to have the security that their loans would be repaid, and therefore they carried on lending. And it allowed the poor people to receive the money that they needed. They no longer had the doors slammed in their faces, and they received the loans even as the year of Shemitah approached. And so, actually, the idea of the prosbul that Hillel instituted brought back the main purpose, the main goal of the Torah command. And he instituted something that could be seen to be kind of just trying to get around it. But ultimately, it's the purpose of the Torah was met perfectly via this institution. We can see also in general in the year of Shemitah, the economy can be struggling. For a year, the fields are not worked, etc., etc. And they therefore decided, this is not written in the Torah, but they decided because of pure economic need, we will never have a leap year in the year of Shemitah. We will never have an extra Adar in the year of Shemitah. For this reason, for the general economy. Now, last year was so interesting. It's really, really rare. But once our Luach has been fixed, our calendar is now fixed. It's rare, but it can happen. We had the year of Shemitah, and it was a leap year. There was Adar Sheni last year. But it's very rare. And this is the reason why. Traditionally, they just didn't do it. In fact, they commonly tried to fit a leap year in the year before Shemitah to allow the farmers that extra time. You know, it's a longer season to finish all the work before the year of Shemitah happens. So this is just one of many, many examples throughout the Talmud of how the interpretation of the rules, of the laws of the Torah is done with a real sensitivity towards human needs, economic matters, etc., etc., so that the markets are functioning properly. We have another area of principles which are employed in the determination of what the halakha should be, and that is ethics. We have ethic principles or moral principles, and they are always there, sort of underpinning the halakha. So let's see how some of these ethics are actually brought in the Torah itself in general terms. The very next source, up here on the page, I am going to read from verse 18, Pasuk Yud Chet. We have this statement, Va'asita hayashar v'hatov be'enei Hashem. You should do what is right and what is good in the eyes of Hashem. Now, this is a very, very general principle. But if we can see, this is written in the Torah itself, and therefore any interpretation of a difficult, challenging halakha, how exactly should we understand it? We will always have at the back of our minds or underpinning our process of interpretation, this principle, this very basic, very general principle of do what is right and good in the eyes of Hashem. And we also have, just jump down, in Sefer Mishlei, the ways of the Torah are pleasant. The ways of the Torah are pleasant, interestingly, were the answer to a very specific, detailed question that I'm about to discuss. And it's so interesting that the answer that was given was not one based on logic, etc., but one based on this ethical principle of, well, the ways of the Torah should be pleasant. What was the situation? We know that if a woman loses her husband and they have not had any children, she should marry the brother or a relative of her deceased husband as performance of the mitzvah of yibum, or alternatively, the process of chalitza. But if there is a widow who has a child, then she doesn't perform this. So the question arose, we have a woman, her husband has passed away. They had a child. Now, she is now remarried, and now her only child from her previous marriage passes away. Does she need to perform chalitza with the relative of her first husband? And the answer that is given is no, The ways of the Torah are pleasant. The ways of the Torah are pleasant, and this would not be pleasant. This would be a humiliation. This would be most unpleasant for her current husband. This would not be a pleasant process for her to go through. And upon that principle, they make the decision, no, such a woman does not need to perform chalitza. And so you can see that no logic was employed, no reasoning, just this principle of ethical standing. We also have the well-known principle of kavod habriot, of honoring humans. And one such application of kavod habriot, to respect others, etc., and to grant them honor, is the situation of a met mitzvah. This is one of the examples given in the Gemara as it's discussing the scope of the principle of kavod habriot. How far can we go in applying this principle? We know that a kohen may not become tamei for anyone besides for a few very close relatives. But what if he comes across a dead body and there are no relatives or anyone close by who can bury the body? So in this situation, he becomes tamei in order to bury the body. This is a met mitzvah. And here the principle is applied to give kavod to the met, to give kavod to the deceased. And its application is wider. This was merely one example. And we have similarly, along the same type of lines, a list given in the Mishnah in Gittin. And the reason for all the things in the list, most of which we won't discuss at all, is mipnei darchei shalom. The reason why we should do such things is because of the ways of peace. You can see at the bottom of the page, it says, Elu dvarim amru mipnei darchei shalom. I'm now going to suggest a whole list of things that you should do, not because they're the strict letter of the law, but because of the ways of peace. I'm going to pick one example. If you turn the page and go to the fourth line, the last word on the fourth line. Mitziat cheresh shotev katan yesh bahem mishum gazel. If I just explain before we discuss what's been written here, we have three categories of people given: a deaf mute, someone without full mental capabilities, and a minor. They, if they find something, are not considered to have the full mental capability to acquire what they found. And therefore they're holding on to something, they possess something, but it's not considered to be theirs. So strictly, according to the letter of the law, anyone can come and take it away from them. So this is saying, Mitziat cheresh shotev katan yesh bahem gazel. Anything that these categories of people have found, the laws of theft apply to them. Because it's an untenable situation to think that you can just go and take anything out of their hands. We can't accept this, mipnei darchei shalom, because of the ways of peace. So although according to the strict letter of the law, one could take anything out of their hands, we can't accept this to be the situation. And therefore you may not do so because of the ways of peace. So again, we see that in understanding the law, we don't just interpret the reasoning, the logic, the sort of very dry details of the law. We do also take into account surrounding principles such as the ways of peace or other principles of ethics, etc. We have, it's very similar to the previous situation we've just been describing. We have the phrase of lifnim mishurat hadin, go beyond the letter of the law, go beyond the strict understanding of the law. And if you flip over the page that looks like this, there's a lovely little Gemara here on this principle of lifnim mishurat hadin. And it says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan insists, Lo chava Yerushalayim ela al shadanu badin Torah, that Yerushalayim was only destroyed because they judged according to din Torah. They judged according to the rules of the Torah. Ela dinei din migzaka ledina. Well, do you want them to take some arbitrary rules and make their decisions based on that? What does it mean that Yerushalayim was destroyed because they applied the rules of the Torah. What else should they have applied? And it says, "Ela ema shehe'emidu dinehem al din Torah v'lo avdu lifnei mishurat hadin." No, but rather understand it to be saying they applied the strict letter of the law and they did not go beyond the letter of the law. And this, according to Rav Yochanan, because of their inability to see beyond the strict, possibly narrow, rigid, strict letter of the law, and they could never go beyond that, this, according to Rav Yochanan, was the reason that Yerushalayim was destroyed. So all of these examples have illustrated to us some wider ethical, moral principles that are employed in the interpretation of the Torah. But we have a question: what happens in halakha if ethical principles which we value are in contradiction to the original purpose of the halakha, or what seems to be the clear understanding of the halakha? So we'll take, for example, the tragic case of mamzerim. A mamzer is a child who is born in an incestuous relationship or a relationship with someone who is married. And a mamzer themselves is not allowed to marry anyone other than another mamzer. This is the law as written in the Torah, and the Rabbanim, Chazal, were pained by the clear suffering of the innocent. The child is just the result of the action, and the child is entirely innocent, and they are the one, unfortunately, who is suffering greatly. The purpose of the halakha was clearly to prevent such actions and to protect the holy, pure institution of marriage. But Chazal were pained by the suffering of the innocent, so much so that they said, I didn't bring this on the source sheet, there is a statement given in the Gemara that says, in the future, le'atid lavo, all mamzerim will be declared to be pure. They couldn't bear this idea. However, they couldn't contradict the clear rule in the Torah. Even Sanhedrin do not have the authority to totally contradict what is clearly written in the Torah. But in their lack of understanding of the suffering of the innocent, they make this statement, in the future, all mamzerim will be pure. In the meantime, what could they do? What they did was, they did not go searching for mamzerim. They did not delve very deeply into the yichus of someone. If someone was not known to be a mamzer, no one would search for or try and find out if they were a mamzer. And we mentioned earlier the general principle of va'asita et hayashar v'hatov b'nei Hashem. Do what is right, do what is good in the eyes of Hashem. The Ramban quotes a comment. If you go back to the source, or you don't need to, I will just find it and read it out. He points out that the first pasuk which I brought, I have no idea how to refer you to it since there aren't any numbers. The page looks like this. It's Dvarim Perek Vav Yud Zayin to Yud Chet, 6 verses 17 to 18. The first verse says, which I didn't read earlier, Shamar tishma'un et mitzvot Hashem Elokechem ve'edotav v'chukav asher tzivach. Keep all the laws, keep all the rules, keep everything that's been commanded to you. And then it flows into the next verse, Va'asita hayashar v'hatov be'enei Hashem. Do what is right and just in the eyes of Hashem. So it seems to be, says the Ramban, that this is in addition to the keeping of all the laws. It's as if there's stage one, keep the laws of the Torah, and then there's stage two, do what is right and just in the eyes of Hashem. Apply this on top of everything else that's on the previous level. And he says many examples of this are given in the Torah. You should stand up for the elderly. You should not curse a deaf person, not put a stumbling block in place in the way of a blind person. You should visit the sick. You should bury the dead. You should visit the mourners, etc., etc. You should give tzedakah, look after the vulnerable in society. So many. But the Ramban says you cannot list everything. You cannot detail every possibility. And this is what we're going to see over and over again throughout our course. You cannot legislate for every possibility, for every situation, for every question that is going to arise. He's talking about it in the specific context of what I would say are ethical matters, moral matters, interpersonal relationships, but it's true in every aspect of halakha. He says, because we've been given some examples, but because you cannot legislate for every specific situation, we have this, so to speak, catch-all. We have this general principle: do what is just and right in the eyes of Hashem, and do what is good. And don't ever forget this in reaching the halakha on any given specific situation. So we've seen how logic is employed. We've seen how ethics are employed. And halakha is there to accompany us in every situation, in every generation, in every different culture, etc., etc. And it is born out of a divine word, a divine law, which by definition, being divine, is in some way inhuman. But the halakha has to be made human for us. It is given to guide our human lives. And therefore, we started to establish the mechanism for doing just that, for interpreting the law and making it a living halakha for human situations. There is a lot of independence granted to Chazal in forming this halakha. We know that the giving of the Torah was described as a brit, as a covenant, which has obviously the mutuality in it. And we have the authority from Hashem over us, but the autonomy given to man to interpret it. And those two go hand in hand. I've brought this lovely, lovely quote from the book Not in Heaven by Eliezer Berkowitz. And he says, so this is, going back to where we were up to, a source here in English. Theonomy liberates the human will from the potentially destructive relativism of its subjectivity. Human autonomy protects the absoluteness of the law against the occasionally negative consequences of its time-alienated objectivity. He's saying the fact that we are absolutely under the rule of Hashem, that is our starting point. God is the only source of authority in the eyes of Judaism. That allows us to be saved from absolute chaos, from everyone saying what they think, from everyone living the way they believe to be correct, because ultimately everyone will have a different opinion, a different truth, a different definition of what is good, what is right. But in the, reflecting the mutuality, the autonomy that Hashem placed in our hands, that he wanted to be in human hands to interpret the law, allows the Torah to be creatively, dynamically interpreted, and to be living and to be relevant for every generation, for every case. And he ends, through halakha, the word from Sinai has become the way of life of the Jewish people throughout history. It's a way of life. We started with that. Halakha is this movement, is this guiding us along a path. And through this mutuality, we are able to have halakha as a relevant guide to our lives in all areas of our lives, in every generation. Now, halakha has gone through a long history. First of all, remember the Torah Baal Peh, which we discussed, was supposed to be Baal Peh. It was supposed to be oral. And it was only written down because of the fear that it would otherwise be forgotten. And by writing something down, by codifying the laws, you do inevitably have the negative side effect that it may stilt the creativity and the ability to see a plethora of opinions. Because once something's written, well, that's black and white on the page. As well as that, we have obviously through different periods in history, galut in itself, the exile of halakha, necessarily makes halakha take on a more defensive, a more protective approach. Think of the Enlightenment period, or in the aftermath of the Reform movement, halakha had an approach of more protective of the values that we want to hold dear to us, a more defensive approach, I would say, in general. But now we have the opportunity to see halakha in its natural habitat, I would say, in Medina Israel, in the state of Israel. And we know that there are certain mitzvot, a whole tranche of mitzvot, which actually can only be performed in Medina, in the state of Israel, in Eretz Israel. Mitzvot hatuluyot ba'aretz, the mitzvot that are dependent on the land of Israel. But the halakha is not the governing legal system for this country. And perhaps halakha coming through the exile isn't prepared to deal with these suddenly new novel situations that are in place. We have a country with Jewish soldiers, with Jewish doctors, with Jewish builders, with Jewish rabbis. There are going to be so many unprecedented questions which arise. Autopsies in Israel, interactions with irreligious Jews, etc., etc. And the question is really how halakha is going to develop, evolve, even in today, this generation, to deal with unprecedented questions. Which brings me on to mention briefly some of the topics that we'll be discussing through the course this year. We will, as I want to bring topics in sort of in short series that have a common denominator. There may be a topic that we are discussing in the context of technology and halakha that can also be fitted into another category. But we will try and have a list or a series of halakhic topics from one category to sort of keep this logical procession going. And as I mentioned, we'll discuss some topics related to Israel and the modern state of Israel. I'd like to do them around the time of Yom Ha'atzmaut, Yom Yerushalayim. We'll discuss some topics of medicine and halakha, how medical advances create new questions, and see how halakha battles with those, technology and halakha, interaction with secular Jews and with non-Jews, and various other matters that are maybe in the realm of kashrut, matters in the kitchen, or matters of economic matters, or related to chagim, etc., etc. And the focus will always be on the process. So rather than the emphasis being on what is the bottom line, which we'll discuss, we'll see different prevalent opinions, the focus will be on the background so that we understand how have these bottom line rulings been reached. And now, after this introduction, we can appreciate that all the more. The real key is to see how the halakhic process was employed to reach the conclusions that were given. I wanted to end by using the last few minutes, really just very last few minutes, I don't want to go over time, by discussing the philosophy of halakha briefly. Because I think it would be remiss of me to end without a brief discussion of the philosophy behind halakha. If we take briefly Rav Soloveitchik was a great leader, great teacher, great speaker, but also a great halachist. He was committedly devoted to halakha and its every detail. But he writes about halakha with such love, and if we see on the source sheet, we just have time to read his first quote. Under Rav Soloveitchik, he writes, "Creative halakhic activity begins not with intellectual calculation, but with vision, not with clear formulations, but with unease, not in the clear light of rational discourse, but in the pre-rational darkness." So he sees halakha as dynamic, as creative. He sees the halakhic personality as not someone who has it all very logical, cut and dry, but as someone who is struggling, who is in conflict, who sees the endless possibilities. And from there, the creative interpretation starts. And that is real halakha to him. And to end with Rav Cordoza, he discusses really beautifully some common criticisms of halakha, including, as we mentioned, that, where's the creativity, where's the room for individuality, etc., etc. And halakha is so far-reaching and demands conformity in so many areas of our life. So why is it just a service of obedience, that we merely perform the acts out of obedience? Where is there any meaning, any internal understanding, appreciation, emotional expression? And he discusses these criticisms and he says, first of all, we believe that the in Judaism, we have a body. Every religion grapples with the body and the soul question. And Judaism believes that if we train the body to do correct actions, we can thereby become or gain an understanding of correct thoughts, of a correct way of life. And mitoch shalolishma balishma, from doing something just because we're doing it, we're performing the deed just because, you get this transformation to have an internal understanding, appreciation of the real meaning behind everything. And we become a living being of what the purpose of all the mitzvot is about. And in response to this idea of doesn't the halakha and don't the many restrictions and boundaries on us, don't they sort of restrict our creativity and individuality? He says it's a mistake to think that constraints and boundaries limit creativity. If you look at art, if you take art, for example, the most fine masterpieces are produced not through absolute chaos, not from a free-for-all, but through real painstaking brushstrokes. If you go close up to the picture that you're looking at, you see every little detail that has been drawn. And the constraints are there as a framework from which is born absolute masterpieces, creativity, beauty. And the same can be applied to music. And this really touched me as a piano teacher. He takes the example of Bach, who was one of the most famous composers, but was rigidly, he very strictly adhered to the rules of composition. But his compositions are very complex, wonderful to listen to, a delight to play. And he says that you can see that the beauty and the music and the creativity was born out of some constraints. And I couldn't summarize his quote in my own words any better, so I've brought a short quote for you. He says, around 3,300 years ago, a unique symphony was composed for an ensemble of no less than 2 million people. Its composer invited his conductor into his chamber at the top of Har Sinai. It was at this apex of history that God handed over to Moshe the masterful score upon which the Jewish people were to play the music of life. God taught him exactly how it needed to be played, not a note more and not a note less. But the vibrations, intonations, interpretations of these notes were up to the musicians standing at the foot of the mountain. We will do and we will hear. Now, Aseh v'nishma means that one hears in the doing. And although the divine voice spoke the same words, nobody heard the same musical sounds, because this depended on the kind of soul each one had. Every Jew is a musician. They play their spiritual music on a musical instrument called halakha. We have been given the notes, and it is left to us to bring them alive. If we seek creativity, the notes are anything but a burden. They are rather a guide. I thought that was a beautiful, beautiful summary of the entire shir in one little paragraph. So I hope you all enjoyed and look forward to seeing you all next week. Please God, have a wonderful week.